All right, I think I'm live here. Um, Andrew told me to count to 60, and I felt like I was playing hide and seek. But I think hopefully my pacing was correct, and I have successfully counted to 60 seconds, and we are now live, and you guys can see my screen. And yeah, I hope everything is good. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank Andrew and the craft beer professionals for hosting this event. I love that it's free to attend. I think that's really a cool resource for people in the brewing community, and I'm really excited to be able to participate and watch the other talks and give this presentation myself. So thank you. A little bit about me before I kind of dive into the meat of the presentation. My name is Tessa Schilaty. I'm a sensory research coordinator at Yakima Chief Hops. My background is kind of, I guess, maybe a little unusual. I did my undergrad in neuroscience. A lot of people, when I say that, they think, wow, how did you end up doing something so different from that? But, there's actually a lot of psychology in designing sensory experiments. There's a lot of kind of nuance with the brain and how you perceive things like texture and flavor. And then there are a lot of underlying kind of biochem stuff. So there's actually a lot more overlap than a lot of people think. But anyway, after my undergrad, I was traveling and working at some different breweries in exchange for room and board. And I really just fell in love with the brewing industry. And somewhere along that journey, I found out about the master's of Brewing and Distilling at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. And so I went and did my master's there, and then got recruited to YCH basically right after I finished that. And I've been here for about a year and a half, and that brings us to present. And my role here, I kind of wear a lot of hats within our sensory team, but my main focus is the brewing or the beer sensory program. So I kind of train and manage a panel of 12 validated beer sensory panelists who we utilize to perform research on, all sorts of different kinds of projects, lots of kind of research and development, so new product development, new formats like cryo, new variety development. But then there's also some kind of quality control projects and customer outreach. So if our brewing customers are having an issue with flavor in their beer, they can send us samples and we'll sort of assess them and try to kind of help them troubleshoot the problems. So yeah, lots of different stuff going on. So now that I've kind of introduced myself, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. First, we're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary, just make sure we're kind of all on the same page with a couple of terms and concepts that are useful. Next, we're going to talk about kind of implementing a sensory program, the strategy, the considerations you'll need to make. There's a lot to it, a lot of buy-in required. So it's good to kind of do a capacity assessment before jumping in feet first. And then we're going to get into the test questions. So these are going to be the different sensory tests I'm going to talk about. And I just like to kind of phrase it more like, what question are you trying to answer? I feel like it really helps kind of focus your efforts if you really have a clear vision of, this is the question I'm trying to answer, so I'm going to do this test. I think it's better than doing it the other way around, just to really make sure you're choosing the right test. So as far as vocabulary, we're going to make a kind of important differentiation between panelists and assessors. It might kind of seem like the same thing, but they're actually kind of different. So a panelist is going to be a very highly trained individual who undergoes a lot of practice with assessing the whatever type of sample you assess, beer, hops, whatever. They're going to train on reference standards. They're going to be tested and validated that they're capable of detecting specific compounds of interest. You can really trust the data that they produce because they have been so well trained and so many times validated. Whereas an assessor is just kind of like your Joe Schmo, like an assessor could be someone you pulled in off the street. Still very valuable for things like consumer research, but you're not looking for a super high level of acuity. You're really just kind of looking for a cross section of the population or whatever when you're using assessors. So a lexicon is another important thing. It's kind of a shared language of a group of people or a branch of knowledge. It's sort of shared descriptive terminology. So you want to make sure that everyone's kind of linguistically on the same page when you're doing sensory, so that you have this list of descriptors that you typically use to describe your product. Everyone on your panel knows what they mean, uses them consistently, and you're all kind of speaking the same language. We're going to talk about blind coding. You should almost always blind code samples, which means you remove any identifying information so that panelists or assessors, they can't tell, what type of beer it is. They don't know if it's your flagship or, your flagship IPA or your new lager or whatever. I mean, they'll be able to tell by tasting it, but there shouldn't be any visually identifying information. We just use like random three-digit number codes so that people are not biased in any way as they enter the assessment of that sample. Carryover is another important consideration. It's the impact of kind of the remainder of a previous sample, how still having a bit of that previous sample in your nostrils or on your tongue might impact your evaluation of a subsequent sample. This is like especially bad in bitter beers. Bitterness can linger on the tongue for minutes. And so it's important to be aware of carryover so that you make sure to build in an appropriate amount of space between samples in any given assessment. And then sensory fatigue is kind of along similar lines. No matter how, even if you take a 3-minute break between each beer, you simply just could not do it all day. Eventually you will become sort of dulled or numbed or blind to specific compounds of interest. And you just lose your acuity, you lose your sensitivity, you probably lose your focus. So, we try to limit the number of samples in any given session just to sort of reduce that overall fatigue and make sure to take at least a couple hours break before coming back to another sample set. So now that we're all speaking the same language, I think it's really important, if you are interested in starting a sensory program, to really take all of these things into consideration, because it's a big job and it's an important job and it should be well planned. And, the goal of your sensory program should really be to support the goals of your brewery or your company overall, and to kind of have that as your guiding mantra or whatever. And so in order to do that, you're going to need to really assess your capacity, and your capacity in a lot of different elements of your capacity. So do you have the people? As I mentioned before, a panel, you need a group of panelists who can spend, at least a couple hours a week assessing and training and things like that. Do the people that work at your company have that kind of time? If not, then you might need to think about a way around that. Do you have a good space for it? Is the space that you want to do sensory in, is it free of loud noises? Is it free of brewery aromas? Those things can really impact how people are able to assess samples and need to be controlled to as high an extent as possible. Do you have the kind of fiscal resources for the materials? Beer spiking kits and reference standards, they're pretty expensive, and you will need to be continuously purchasing them to keep your panel trained. It's not a one and done kind of thing, unfortunately. Training requires a lot of upkeep, so it can get a little bit expensive, and it's important to kind of price that out and make sure that that's still within the budget for this endeavor. Next, you're going to want to elect a sensory champion. Maybe if you are listening to this presentation, maybe that's you, if you're interested, especially because I think one of the most important things about your sensory champion is that they care. They got to give a darn about sensory, and they have to have a passion for it. And if they don't, then it's not going to work out very well. So who is that person? If it's you, great job, welcome. You do have to be interested and care. And then, on top of that, there's a skill set. Sensory is a science. If you don't already have a sensory program, chances are you don't have a sensory scientist working at your brewery. But that's okay. You don't need a sensory scientist, but you do need probably for your sensory champion to take an online course, maybe buy a textbook, do some research. There's there's a lot of things to be considered, and so that person's going to need to learn. Next, we are going to talk a little bit about kind of getting your buy-in. This is, you've done the first two things. You've got your time, your space, your materials. You got your passion, you got your skills, but now you need to convince the company that this is a worthwhile endeavor. So you really want to make sure that the support is coming from the top down, and there's really a culture around sensory and supporting sensory. I know our sensory team feeds a lot of other departments in a lot of different ways, so it's good in the beginning to kind of reach out across the company and really find where sensory could be useful. If you're starting a sensory program, it's going to be a part of your overall quality program, so it's important to coordinate with them. Marketing can use a lot of sensory data, to make sure that the claims they're making are true, the descriptions are accurate. And this is kind of the little bit of a sticky wicket, is that what kind of impact is the sensory program actually going to have? Because you might get into a situation where, the sensory team is evaluating whether or not a beer is good to release to market. And if they say no, if they flag it and say it's got off flavors, we can't release it, who do you tell that to, and what are they going to do about it? Because if they get that information and they say, it's just too expensive to hold the beer, we got to can it, we got to get it out, we need that tank, whatever, and do that anyway, then all that work you did for your sensory program kind of is in vain a little bit, if it's not going to make an actual impact on the decision making. So that's important to consider as well. Is this actually going to make a difference? Are people actually going to use sensory to make business decisions? And finally, I think it's really important to just kind of define your goals. A sensory program is going to look different depending on what exactly you're trying to achieve. If you have this really steady flagship that does, really well for you and you brew it all the time, you are going to want to make sure that that's consistent. Maybe that's your goal, consistency in the market of your flagship beer. Or maybe you're trying to create a program that helps you develop really innovative, new, fun, quirky beers that are kind of going to be these one-off releases. And you want to make sure that they're tasting good. That's actually kind of a separate goal, a different goal. Maybe it's both of those things. That's fine too. It's just going to take a little bit more time and materials. But it's good to kind of at the beginning have a really solid idea of what you want to get out of your sensory program and, where the data is going to go. So with that in mind, let's get into the actual test types. So I think sort of the bread and butter of most breweries' sensory programs is going to be this true to brand, true to type TTB test, which answers the question, does this beer taste the way we describe it to taste, or also kind of, is this beer in or out of spec? And it should be used only for the brands that are consistently produced in the brewery, not for one-offs. You need to kind of have historical data about this, about a brand for this to make any sense. And it's really just a binary score. So panelists become very familiar with the brand being tested. They taste it a lot. They should know what kind of off flavors it's susceptible to, what they're looking out for. And then they should be able to tell whether or not a sample in front of them adequately aligns with how it should taste, or whether it's out of spec. It has an off flavor. It's not achieving something that it should be achieving. And when you're doing these, it's good to kind of slip in some spiked samples, things that shouldn't pass, and make sure that they're failing spiked samples as well, and to kind of keep them on their toes. And so this looks like basically presenting panelists with the baseline and experience with the brand, and then they give it a pass or fail. So the way this kind of statistics around this work, and we're not going to get too into the weeds of statistics because this is an intro and we don't have time, but you use what's called a P chart, or a percent defect chart, and that's going to track the kind of normal daily batch to batch variation within a beer. This screen that is shown here is a Draft Lab P chart, and they're really their apps are really good for this. But basically, you're going to define, what is an acceptable amount of people flagging the beer as out of spec over time. And in a very consistent beer, it should be not that many people, not that often, flagging it as defective. And hopefully you can kind of bring that control limit down over time. And I think this is really useful or important because, consumers are becoming a lot more savvy about beer. They have a lot more knowledge and their expectations are higher. And so if you're releasing a beer to market that is, varies wildly, people are going to lose their faith in the product. It doesn't look good for your brand. And this is also important for kind of helping your brewery adapt to natural variations in agricultural products. Like as a hop supplier, we do everything in our power to maintain a really high quality, consistent hop product. But at the end of the day, it's agricultural. Same with malt. So, there's going to be year to year variation. That is part of the delight of brewing. It's an art as much as a science, but you need to know, if your panelists keep flagging beers brewed with your new Citra as being, it's too catty, they're failing it because the beer is too catty, then you might need to replace a little bit of that Citra with, another citrus forward, but less catty hop like Laurel or something. These are kind of, this test will help you make those adjustments as you go to try to keep that really consistent product over time. The next test I'm going to talk about is kind of a category of tests: descriptive analysis, descriptive tests. And this is actually sort of the bread and butter of our sensory program. So this is sort of what we do more often than not. And it answers the very broad question, what does this sample smell or taste like? What are the flavors here? And this is really useful for things like recipe development. Say you want to get a really citrusy IPA, then you can run through descriptive analysis some samples, and whichever one people say is the most citrusy, you might go, great, that's the one, that's our recipe. It's useful for marketing. I kind of touched on this earlier, but just really making sure that if you describe this beer on your website as being passion fruit, guava, grapefruit, and rose, or whatever, that's actually what people are tasting. That's what your panelists are telling you they taste. It's easy enough to type those words into a description, but is that what's really there? Like, that's actually important. And so what it looks like is a group of highly trained panelists sitting in a booth, filling out these really long ballots talking about every aspect of aroma, flavor, taste, mouthfeel. You can do it with hops as well, so that would just be aroma, obviously. But really, really digging into the flavor, one beer at a time, no other distractions. And because of that, this is a kind of high input test. Like, it takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of time, but you get what you pay for effort-wise. So this gives you tons of information about a beer sample. There's kind of two different camps or two different ways you can collect this data. The first one is quantitative descriptive analysis, usually abbreviated to QDA. And this is where panelists are asked to actually rank the intensity of each sensory attribute. So imagine you could click and drag back and forth these black circles to indicate the intensity. And then the result is just the average kind of percentage that everyone reported the intensities at. And so this needs to be done on an unnumbered line scale because people have funny biases around specific numbers, their favorite number, least favorite number, odds versus evens. People are kind of quirky and will make choices based on things that are not necessarily attributes of the sample. So unnumbered just eliminates any number biases. But one of the issues that arises with this is that people really use these scales quite differently. So some people are really timid panelists and they just kind of hang out in that bottom 30%, and they don't feel very confident to say, like, drag it all the way over. And then there's other panelists who are super confident, they'll drag it all the way to rate like 100% intensity. And so it takes a lot of training to kind of get everyone to use the sample or to use the scale the same. And you can also use some statistics to kind of normalize the fact that people use the scale differently. But then you're kind of getting into some issues about whether or not you're dampening variation between individuals, which is really important. That's why we have 12 people assess the samples, because we know individuals vary a lot and we need to account for that. So if you start to kind of use statistics to squeeze everyone's data together, are you losing some of the like individual nuance? I don't know. It's kind of complicated, which is why this is, I don't know, a good alternative, I guess. Check all that apply, or CATA, people call it. And this is also descriptive analysis, but it's a little bit simpler. Instead of scaling the intensity of any attribute, you simply tick, yes, it's there, or no, it's not. It doesn't matter if it's a hint or a full blast to the face. You tick it if it's there at all. What's kind of a funny thing about this is that we usually use the first one with the scaling, and so our panelists get used to that. But if we have a lot of samples to get through, or we're checking for something really quickly, we'll use CATA ballots like this. And sometimes those panelists they'll do like 3 ticks to say something's really citrusy, and then like 1 tick, or like smaller ticks and big ticks. It's like they can't let go of the control that we gave them to indicate the intensity to us, which is kind of funny. But anyway, it's completely beside the point. And then, so for this test, we basically use the percentage or the frequency of the ticks as a proxy for intensity. So if 9 out of 10 people ticked citrus, we'll probably say that's pretty citrusy. 9 out of 10 people got that as a flavor. That's pretty high consensus on a single attribute. If 3 out of 10 people ticked citrus, you know, it's probably there. 3 people agreed that it was there, but 7 people didn't get any at all. So that's probably a, you know, slightly less intense flavor or aroma or whatever. So it's kind of a proxy. And this requires a little bit less rigorous training. You know, you're just training on identification of a flavor or aroma, but you do lose that nuance of the intensity. And so you have lower resolution data. You're kind of losing one piece of information when you don't have the scale. So there's definitely kind of pros and cons to both ways of collecting that data. But either way, you're going to get, you know, a good picture of the flavors present in a beer sample or an raw material sample. And if all that sounds like a little too much for the beginning of your sensory panel journey, a roundtable assessment is a pretty good jumping off point. And it just kind of helps you answer the question, like, what is the general vibe of this product? Like, what are people's general thoughts? You can use a moderator to kind of guide it towards answering more specific questions. But, you know, you can get a lot of information out of this. And, you know, what does it look like? It's a group of people sitting around a table. We've probably all done this formally or informally at some point. Fun fact, the table doesn't have to be round. So don't go blowing your whole budget on you know, on a round table from Restoration Hardware. Your square one will be fine. You know, it'll be fine. And this is like an interesting thing to do because it's so close to how we kind of casually taste beer that it's really susceptible to a lot of kind of biases and influences. So, you know, you're going to need a moderator to kind of keep the conversation flowing in the right direction, keep things on topic, and really to keep dominant personalities from absolutely, you know, taking over the conversation. People are really susceptible to being influenced by other people, especially if it's someone, you know, kind of higher up in the company, you know, the CEO or the head brewer. They're going to start saying things that they taste and everyone's going to start agreeing with them, whether or not they actually agree with them. And so it's sort of the moderator's job to make sure that everyone feels empowered to speak and that everyone's comfortable, you know, maybe disagreeing with each other. It's creating this like very collaborative atmosphere and making sure that lots of different palettes and types of experience are represented. You know, you want to make sure you have a diverse group of people at your roundtable so that you can get a nice kind of range of opinions. But because it's so kind of wishy-washy in this way, there's not really any statistical or scientific value to conducting a roundtable assessment. You know, you're not going to like publish a research article based on your findings from a roundtable, but it can be a good place to start. Maybe it'll give you some new questions that you can use other tests to answer. And maybe you don't always need to have statistical validity to get, useful information out of an assessment. So this is a good option for those kinds of situations. Next, I want to talk about the tetrad test. You've maybe heard of a triangle test, which is kind of the spiritual predecessor to this tetrad test. But the tetrad test has slightly more statistical power. Again, we don't really need to get into statistics today, but we use the tetrad test. We've replaced using the triangle test with this. And what it answers is, are these two samples noticeably different? And this can be really useful for checking, raw material or process change. You're going to make a change. You want to see if the resulting product is the same as the one that came before, or if people can really easily tell the difference between them. This is an unspecified difference test, which means you're not actually telling them the nature of the difference. You're not asking which one's sweeter or whatever. You're just asking if they're the same. And I actually really struggle to describe this test. I don't really know why. Whatever part of my brain that helps people describe tetrad tests is not very strong. So I have visual aids I've prepared. So this is what it would look like if you were performing a tetrad test. You would receive 4 beer samples, but actually it's 2 sets of 2 samples, but they're blind coded and mixed up and randomized, so you don't know which 2 match. You don't know what 2 are the matching pairs. And so your role would be to taste them, smell or taste. You could do this with hops as well, or malt or anything. And you're going to go left to right, and you're going to match the pairs. So we just have people circle the 2 that they think match. If you really can't tell a difference, we ask that people guess. And so for this, hypothetical example, we'll say that this assessor thought that 472 and 935 were the matching pairs. So they've circled those, which indicates that 387 and 601 are also a matching pair. And just in this hypothetical example, I'm going to say that they got it wrong. So it was actually 472 and 601 that matched, and then 387 and 935 that matched. A lot of times people will be like, oh no, I'm so bad at sensory, I didn't get it right. But it's not a failure. It just means that these samples were so similar that you couldn't really tell them apart. And that can actually be a good thing. Say from before, you switched your malt supplier and you did this tetrad test to see if the beer still tastes the same, and the vast majority of people couldn't really tell them apart. That's actually great news. You can carry on with that switch, and you know that it's not going to have a huge impact on the flavor of your beer. But if the vast majority of people kind of can correctly identify the pairs, the matching pairs, then that means that there's a perceptible difference now, and maybe we need to address that. Maybe we need to ask another question, is the beer better now? Or maybe, I don't know, it's a start for a conversation anyway. But it's important not to kind of overextend this test. You only get to know if the 2 things are different. You don't get to know the nature of the difference. You don't get to know if people prefer one over the other or anything like that. So this test we often use it in conjunction with other tests, not within the same session, but within the same study. And finally, I'm going to talk about preference testing. This is an affective test, or a hedonic test. So it basically has to do with how much people like it. This is important. This is maybe the most important. Do people like your beer? That's an important question to ask. It's most useful actually for comparison. So if the amount that someone likes something is only really useful in its comparison against another thing, that's the only thing that actually gives that meaning. So it's kind of good to give people 2 or 3 options and have them either rank them or rate them on a scale of liking, 1 to 16 or something. So a brewery could use this for choosing between 2 potential versions of a recipe. They could have a keg of each in their tap room, have customers vote on their favorite, and then they know kind of, or they have a better idea of which one is a good one to scale up and roll out. We see breweries do this a lot for the selection of raw materials. So like choosing a new a hop variety for a new beer, just getting an idea of what people like the best, or what the brewers like the best, or whatever. And it just looks like presenting the assessor with 2, sometimes more, but we're going to want to be careful about that, sensory fatigue and carryover effects and things like that. So it shouldn't be too many. But 2 to maybe 5 blind coded samples, and you want to make sure they're randomized, because the way that you assess your first sample of the day actually is like pretty different from the way that you assess subsequent samples. So you want to make sure they're all mixed up. And yeah, you just can't do too many. Like if someone gave me 10 beers and asked me to rate them like in order of preference, I think my palate would just kind of like, I don't know, it would give up a little bit, and I'd probably get a little bit drunk and the data wouldn't be very good. So it's important to think of things like that. And yeah, basically you're just asking assessors to quantify their liking for you. And this is another situation where it's kind of good to make sure that the assessors actually kind of represent like your target market, or the types of people that will be, will be drinking the beer. Like if you're rolling out a new sour beer and you're trying to decide between 2 different fruit additions, and so you have them in the tap room, people who don't like sour beers like probably aren't good to recruit for this, because they're going to say, I liked neither, or they're going to give everything a really low rating. When, really it might be an amazing sour beer. That person just doesn't drink sour beer. So, that's an important consideration as well, to like make sure that your data is, actually useful to you, basically. Yeah, so I think, I'm getting pretty close to time here. Let's see. Yeah, so that's all I have about sensory tests. But that was again a pretty whirlwindy tour of starting a sensory program and different sensory tests you can choose from. It's certainly not enough information really to get started, just more of an overview, getting a taste for it. So if you have any questions at all, any technical questions for our research and development team, you can email us anytime, technicalsolutions@Yakima Chief. If you have any questions for me specifically about anything in this presentation, about beer sensory, about anything at all, my email is tessa.Schilaty@Yakima Chief. And I also have some resources here if you want to dive a little bit deeper into, the actual implementation and like interpretation of these tests. There's a lot to learn, and I commend you for taking this on if you have the intention of starting a sensory program. I think it's the coolest thing in the world. I think it's so fun, and I hope you do too. And I'm not sure how I will actually receive questions from this program. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think it'll just be my big face. And let's see, there I am. I can see no questions. I don't know if I would be able to see them anyway, but you have my email address anyway. You can find me and ask me questions. And thanks again to Andrew and CBP. That was a lot of fun. And yeah, I hope to hear from everyone, and good luck out there. Bye.